In terms of superpowers then, here is the first part of the spec. So what are superpowers and how have they changed over time? So a superpower, as I mentioned to you right at the start, is a nation or group of nations that has a leading position in international politics. The balance of these positions can shift over time. So long story short, it was the UK, we'll look at this more detail in a minute, but the UK was the first regional superpower, arguably, maybe the Roman Empire, but certainly in modern history it was the UK, and it has shifted since the end of the wars, Second World War and Cold War, to more the USA, and now there's the idea of a multipolar world, okay? These are the 7 characteristics of a superpower, okay? Any country, any group of countries that wants to be a superpower, you can categorise them with these 7. So I showed you a list of countries, and I showed you examples of these. So physical size and location, demographic factors, people, political, natural resources, economic power and influence, military and culture. Okay, there is a spectrum because now there's the idea and concept of emerging superpowers. They have growing influence, India and China, for example. Okay, now emerging powers are not quite at superpower status, they're heading towards it. That's the idea. Okay, so they may have a powerful set of characteristics, but they haven't got everything lined up powerfully like maybe the USA currently has. And there's also an idea about regional powers playing an important economic and political role on their continent around them. So, in today's modern world, you could argue it looks something like this. The USA being that big superpower, the UN, because it's obviously got a bit more money, but split up between different countries, being more emerging, they're heading towards that way. The same for China, don't forget. But then you have India, Russia, Brazil, and other nations like Japan and other oil-rich Gulf states in South Africa heading that way, being more of a regional power, powerful in their region. So yes, these are the characteristics. Physical size and location plays a massive role. The resources of a country play a massive role. The population size, obviously, that's going to impact the amount you have in terms of workforce and military. Economic power and influence on the global stage. Okay? Maybe aid has a big part of that in terms of how much you receive and how much you give. Military force and military strength. You can also look at this idea of dominant belief systems and religion and culture being a massive part of superpower identity. Okay, I taught you about McDonaldization, I'll come on to it later, but McDonaldization is an example of cultural influence too. So there's no more examples here on these slides on Moodle. Okay, so there's your characteristics, you complete the table, and then I started to introduce you to the idea of hard versus soft power. Hard being more direct influence, soft being a little bit more passive. Okay, so for example, the USA versus China. China's definitely gone through soft power. The USA, technically both, but has gone through hard power in the past. If you're looking at the history, so I started off by talking about the first original superpower really in modern history was the British Empire, and about how it achieved that status through mainly direct approaches. Okay, also indirect too. So over history had imperialism and capitalism introduced to these areas, they didn't really have them. Colonialisation was the massive key part of that too. Okay, so there's the British Empire as an example of how much power Britain had in these 1920s, and the Cold War shifted that towards a multipolar world. Okay, the idea about having multiple powerful entities. Okay, so then you have the idea about uni-power and colonial rule. So yes, imperialism definition right there, colonialism and colonisation, all three definitions, importantly you know them. This happened across the world and some examples there. So colonialism is when one state has political control over other territories. British Empire was a part of that. Okay, that's the example of a colonial superpower. I didn't mention this in a lot of detail at the time, but a case study you could use in terms of the British Empire, it is one in its own self, but you can look at how it took Kenya, for example. I've put some notes in for you there. In terms of bipolar, rather than unipolar, bipolar would be more than like a couple of countries contesting. So bipolar means two nations equally powerful. The Cold War saw this, the USA versus the USSR. They both believed they were the rightful superpowers, and therefore it linked to conflict. It was basically communism versus capitalism, as I've put here. Two different identity theories of the world. Then you have the BRIC nations emerging. You had the takeoff model in terms of a society taking off and developing and becoming a superpower. However, that had some criticisms too, like borrowing heavily, debt and things like that. And I didn't mention this in the lessons, but there is kind of a north-south divide. Okay, there's the breakdown you can see about how there is technically a north-south divide, although there's a couple of anomalies in Australia and South Africa between being a superpower or certainly having power and maybe having less power. But that is changing all the time. I've put some new theories in here for you to have a little look at, like Kinder's-Hartmann theory, for example, about how the balance of power has changed. So maybe that might be worth reading your revision, okay, just to complement your superpower studies already. And about how basically whoever ruled the area would command the heart, and whoever ruled the heart would command the world island. It was a filtering process, okay. So then we had a look at India and China, and about how they've taken off and gone through over time. They are the emerging superpowers, don't forget. I've put some counter arguments of that here as well, and how they changed over time from the Industrial Revolution to now. Okay? But superpower rule has changed more recently. We used to have colonialism, but more recently, in the neo times, the new times, it's more maybe indirect control and indirect neo-colonial rules. So, neo-colonialism is a form of indirect control over developing countries. So it means new. So even though they're independent, technically they still have that kind of power. So military, politically, economically, and culturally. Okay? So I gave you some examples of how maybe power is exerted through giving aid, through aid with TNCs, don't forget. We'll give you this money, but you have to decide, we decide how you spend it. TNCs, terms of trade. Not getting power directly, but making them give you some power, or giving you power, or earning power indirectly. Okay? So tide aid, debt, trade, all these things, you can use the idea about neocolonialism. And I gave you an article about the Ghana situation, and about how these three elements here, commodity traders, overseas tariffs, and the WTO, linked into this example. Well, there is a criticism. There's still war, conflict, corruption, and there's some problems with neocolonialism. Before the second part, the role of superpowers. So, what are the impacts on the global economy and politics and the environment? So we did that in lessons 2. This is where I told you about TNCs. So, for example, we looked at TNCs like those having that much wealth, okay, and influence over time, and about how they can maintain control. So this is the theory of Americanization, okay, globalization and the development of global hegemony. So this idea that there's one company that rules, or a bit like monopoly. So culture, don't forget the idea about people from same culture share common values and beliefs. That could be religion, language, other norms. And about how there could be a global culture. The idea about American cultural imperialism and things like McDonaldization link in here. So it can be enforced, or it could be voluntarily adopted, as these things often are. So the idea about global culture, and I showed you some negatives of this, example of it, advantages, but also negatives, and some backlash for that, as countries actually didn't adopt this global culture. They wanted their own one, and they wanted their own individual cultures to be respected. So I had a lot of examples here of countries and examples rejecting the idea of global culture. For example, the French Disneyland Paris and those dolls from Saudi Arabia. But not just those two. Then I mentioned about IGOs, if you remember, intergovernmental organisations. So how they play a part in the world economy, for example. So there's some examples, the G7/G8, United Nations, all those things. And I've given you these as handouts already. So about how they can influence economics, politics and military, i.e. global conditions. I've given that list already, so you have these sheets. So the United Nations was your first example. All these informations here, don't forget about how it was formed, when it was formed, why it was formed, where it was formed, how the structure of it looks. It could be an example, a very good example, of how organisations can play a part in the planet of powers today. Other UN agencies include these 4, the WHO, UNICEF, UNESCO and FAO, and the UN General Assembly is a key part of that too. So in terms of the UN General Assembly, another branch of the United Nations, don't forget, Okay? About how people have votes, the function of the UN, the members, the right of veto, the action resolutions, the examples of them. Again, I'll put this on a case study list, not actual full mega poster case studies, but smaller examples like Thailand and Cambodia, for example, as an example of where disputes have been settled by the UN, a superpower in its own right, where the UN's been involved. The second example I taught you was about NATO. So NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Again, I told you in these slides what the purpose of NATO was, the Article Treaty about it. I would definitely recommend looking at the NATO alliance, but also things like the Warsaw Pact and how it started and how it formed, and potentially therefore the start of some conflict, and about how it expanded eastward and maybe added new members, and maybe that wasn't appeasing everybody, and about how in 2014 some conflict escalated in Russia, and this was put down as a contributing factor. Okay, the NATO-Russia Council having these relations and conflicts between NATO and Russia is a criticism. If you're asked to look at maybe the problems of organisations like NATO, Russia, example, is a massive part of that. And about having these modern evidences of Russia's involvement with NATO, for example, the political element, the military element. Before our final inquiry question, the impact of superpowers on the global economy, existence, and the environment. Actually, I mentioned before, wasn't it? I put that in there twice. So sorry, the G7 as 2014. There's the members, all on Moodle for you on the slides. Their function, decision making, the G7. So it gets another example: United Nations, NATO, and now the G7. Okay, and how it became the G7 from the G8 because of this aforementioned tension, the impacts it has on them. Then you have the WEF as well, and what they've contributed to the global forum. I won't go over this too much. And the World Bank and the IMF being your other examples too, and how they work. Some interesting stats there that you might want to use in an essay that requires it. So, again, not big case studies, but Singapore, Japan, all this stuff you certainly can use. I've then tied in some synoptic links here. So I taught you about Malthus, for example, and the idea of population and having that kind of impact on food supply and there being a point of crisis. Then Bosserup's food supply and population racing against each other theory, and then Beddington's 2030 perfect storm. You could use these in some questions should you want to, okay? And about how we can have impacts on the environment. This was environmental concerns that directly links into the three theories. So, China was your biggest example, but I put a load of these on your case study sheet. So China's a good example about impact on the environment, air pollution, cancer villages, things like that, but also other examples too. And whether these global agreements to try and reduce these things are effective. I put loads of examples of Bristol, New York, Zai Pits, for example, in Burkina Faso. There's some other examples about how the impact on the environment can vary. China being the main one, there's some data for you. And then, finally, rising tensions. So there has been an increase in tensions between powers, okay? So in a multipolar world, or bipolar world, different powers are going to be competing against each other, okay? So, we looked at the Middle East as an example of that. You all had your different examples. I won't go over that in too much detail because you all had those case studies, of which I have forwarded to you, I believe. I'm still waiting for... Yes, I have already. Fine. Terrorism. So terrorism being like kind of an indication of this, and the clash of cultures, and the idea of rejecting global culture, for example, and about how economic restructuring has occurred also to these changes. And then finally, it was the USA versus the EU as a proper conflict, okay, between powers. Is it inevitable? You can argue yes, you can argue no, okay? Is it inevitable? You could say yes in the battle for power, but you could say no, as in like NATO and agreements that work together. So I told you about how the USA and the EU have differing opinions on trade, on management, on military, and you have that comparison table already. and about how China could be taking advantage of these two getting at each other to maybe be that new power. So here was the 4 different futures that we looked at in terms of what the future could hold. Whether it be unipolar, that US hegemony, whether it be multipolar, that regional mosaic of different powers working together. Maybe the new Cold War, a bipolar element of China and the USA, and maybe a unipolar where China overtakes the USA entirely. Okay? Having that stability, having those resources, having that military element is really, really, really important. Now, the final slide is this. Very important. Okay? I want to make sure this is known, and when I looked through the lessons, there was one part that I wasn't happy with the amount of detail I went over, and this was probably it. Okay? Now, superpowers are countries that, you know what they are? That's fine. They have global reach. They have global influence. They have multiple strengths. That pillars of power argument, okay? The USA, China, EU. Whereas emerging are usually gaining power. Now, I've taught you about how natural resources can include land, territory, ocean, physical resources, fossil fuels, ores, okay? That's like methane and stuff. Even access such as Arctic sea routes, spheres of influence concept. Now, mechanisms do exist for resoluting these disputes. That's really important. I'll say that again. Mechanisms exist to try and basically solve any conflicts, solve any disputes. For example, like the USA versus the EU or China or wherever it may be. Okay, UNCLOS, for example. You can have a look at how that finds resolutions to disputes. It could be argued that tensions are not inevitable. Maybe tensions together aren't inevitable because the UN and other organisations like the EU have systems in place to reduce tension. Okay? They have things where they can reach agreements. Maybe they can make decisions in the oceans, but actually they need to come together to work this out and make compromises. However, there is this idea that tensions are inevitable. Tensions could happen and will happen wherever our efforts are. Okay? Maybe it might be between China as a power exerting that power on Taiwan, Philippines and Indonesia. Maybe it's Russia's actions in Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine. Debatable, yes, but in terms of that did cause a tension. Whatever you may think of it, it caused a tension. So therefore, maybe it's inevitable. Has there been attempts from Turkey and France? Absolutely, to try and negotiate and try and help this, but it still hasn't worked. So maybe tensions are inevitable. Spheres of influence. So Eastern Europe, the Middle East, South China Sea, they're all like involved in distant places not nearby to where they are. Okay? Maybe that has linked to that earlier topic of colonisation. I want to make sure that you know about these clear links between topics taught at the start of the module and the end. Okay? So colonial impacts is still felt today with language, for example, still prevalent in these countries that were once colonised by the UK and France, for example. Okay? In a more populous world where there's more people living here, there's greater demand for resources. Therefore, maybe resources, this seems to provide diversity a little bit, of water, of course. Maybe it is inevitable. There'll be tension over water, tension over food supply. Bring in some of those synoptic theories, Malthus, Bosworth, for example, there. Okay? On the other hand, a green shift between renewable energy is another counter-argument. If there's a shift for power to become more renewable and greener energy, then actually what could happen here is it could reduce tensions over fossil fuels. Countries could become less dependent, for example. Okay? There's many disputes, even over that, resources and land. Don't forget those characteristics of superpowers. Many territorial disputes. They're very long-running. India and Pakistan over Kashmir, for example, still going on today, really, which might suggest that resolutions are hard to come by. There's a lot of tensions in the world still going on from years and years and years ago. Israel-Palestine. It's been going on not since 2024, October the 7th. It's been going on since the 1940s, really, to be honest with yourselves, okay? And it hasn't been resolved, even with the recent resolution. It doesn't seem to have worked, okay? Maybe resolutions are very hard to come by, or maybe countries have no interest in resolving the conflict. No settling for mediocrity. But natural resources is not only the source of tension, it could be trade, it could be cultural influence, like a backlash we looked at earlier, geopolitical blocks, Brexit, maybe as in a different political ideology, and it can all lead to tension between superpowers, Brexit being a more recent example of that, between the EU and the UK.